Shadow of Memories, which released for the PS2 back in March of 2001, or Shadow of Destiny for those of you in the US, may well be one of the strangest titles Konami has ever produced. From a developer that has given us Castlevania, Silent Hill, Contra, Suikoden, Metal Gear, among a host of other genre-defining titles, this under-the-radar PS2 offering released by Konami back at the start of the PS2's life cycle was overlooked by many, sandwiched as it was between heavyweights such as Tekken Tag Tournament, Ridge Racer 5 and Gran Turismo 3. Today we're going to find out why that was and what exactly a giant developer such as Konami were doing, making a game that blended occultism, time travel and a murder mystery all baked into a quiet German town no less, as they're launching product into the West for the best-selling console of all time. Shadow of Memory started out as the brainchild of Suikoden 1 and 2 character designer and illustrator Junko Kawano, with Shadow of Memories being her first directorial debut at Konami and marking her as the first female video game director at the company also. Kawano had been pretty much fascinated by Faustian myth ever since her childhood, that long famous making a deal with the devil in order for a power proposition, and had wanted to turn that basic premise into a video game ever since playing Chunsoft's Autogoriso for the Super Famicom. Autogoriso, which translates to St. John's Wort in English, maybe not the best name for a video game in fairness, was basically an interactive novel with horror elements added in, telling the tale of a young couple stranded at a remote manor in the middle of the night, and relied heavily on its atmospheric use of sound to really drive home the plot. Kawano thought that this approach could work well on current hardware at the time, given the significant jump in power since the days of the Super Famicom. And after drafting a script and a basic outline of the time travel mechanics that would form the central idea of the plot, she then approached the Konami top brass in order to get the go-ahead for this PS2 game. Konami didn't wait long and gave Kawano the green light for her title, giving her a small team of 5 additional people to help develop the game and a limited budget. Kawano used these resources to travel over to Germany, most notably to the small town of Rothenburg in northern Bavaria, to draw inspiration for the title. Rothenburg is famous for its medieval old town, drawing in tourists from around the world each year, and is one of only 4 towns still left in Germany that has completely intact city walls. The small Japanese team visited museums, took pictures and immersed themselves fully in the local culture and folklore of Rothenburg on their trip, getting a much better handle on the game they were going to create in the process. However, while the core idea of a Faustian bargain combined with death and time manipulation mechanics had all been there for Kawano since the mid-1990s, the actual name of the project for the PS2 would be a lot harder to settle on. The first draft for the title of the game was named The Day and Night of Walpurgisnacht, an old German folklore tale named after a saint in the area that centres on witches meeting on the Sabbath of April 30th at the summit of the Harz Mountains in northern Germany. While the premise of the name no doubt sounded interesting to Kawano and her team, especially after coming back from their visit to Germany, the business higher-ups at Konami were far less impressed, shooting down The Day and Night of Walpurgisnacht, wisely so, and quickly dropping it as a working title for the game. The second name the developers hit upon was just a shortened variation of the first, pretty much, namely The Days of Walpurgis, but this too was deemed too much of a cryptic title by the Konami suits, who raised, the concern, rightly so, that this would confuse the vast majority of gamers who would have been completely oblivious to the old German folklore tale. So from overly complicated, the team quickly pivoted to overly simplistic, coming up with the absolutely bland Time Adventure on their third try, a remarkably hackneyed title that thankfully the team didn't take too long to revise to the eventual name of Shadow of Memories, or indeed Shadow of Destiny, like we said, for those of you over in the US, that hit store shelves not long after. Why this was changed to Shadow of Destiny specifically for the US market, releasing the Shadow of Memories for both Japan and Europe, is as yet unconfirmed, but reports are that the publishers felt that the word Destiny evoked more of a mystery type of feeling and intrigue than Memories did, so they switched the title as well as the box art for the US release. A playable demo for the game was released for September 2000's Tokyo Game Show that, performed well above expectations, drawing in a surprisingly large crowd, which was unexpected given the event was mainly focused on showcasing eagerly anticipated upcoming titles such as Hideo Kojima's Zone of the Enders, the PS2 release of Onimusha Warlords, Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec, along with Jet Set Radio also. However, Shadow of Memories managed to hold its own among that illustrious bunch, garnering a growing buzz from both the public and press row about its atmospheric storytelling and interesting time travel mechanics contained within, setting it apart from the more traditional games releasing in and around that time. Shadow of Memories released for the PlayStation 2 worldwide in February and March of 2001, and later to the Xbox 18 months later for PAL regions, with a PC release coming not long after. Now, before we get into the story and gameplay and all the rest of that good stuff, if you're enjoying what we do over here at the RetroHauler, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, as it helps us out a ton. And as always, thank you for taking the time to watch. And now back to the video. As always, spoilers ahead for Shadow of Memories as we delve into the mechanics, story elements, as well as the many choice consequences of this game also. The game begins with our main protagonist, Ike Kush, exiting a side street cafe in the small German town of Lebensbaum, modelled after the real-life town of Rothenburg that we mentioned earlier. Ike looks at his watch as he is due for an appointment, but not long after this he is struck down through a knife in the back by an unknown assailant. As Edge magazine put it in their June 2000 preview of the game, Shadow of Memories is perhaps the first game in history that begins with a game over screen, with its hero stabbed in the back. That premise is what led to all the buzz back at the Tokyo Game Show that year, and Edge's 5-page preview spread highlights that the game was attracting significant public attention also. Ike wakes up in what is effectively limbo, a kind of halfway house between the living and the dead, and is greeted there by a strange voice who offers to make Ike a deal. This is where the Faustian packed part of Kawano's vision for the game comes into play, with the voice offering to restore Ike back to life in a seemingly altruistic move. Ike is quick to refuse such an offer, however, accusing the voice of being the devil itself, with its seemingly benign deal obviously geared toward taking his soul at some later point. The voice simply laughs this off, however, stating openly that Ike's survival is the only thing important to it right now, and if Ike wants to refuse the offer, that's certainly his own choice. Given Ike's severe lack of options at this point, however, it's no surprise to see him quickly reconsider his initial refusal and take up the stranger's offer of help. What's pretty incredible about this whole limbo scene, however, is that the voice of Ike's unknown benefactor is none other than Charles Martinet himself, who you may know better as Super Mario.
It's a me, Mario!
Playing the titular Italian plumber in no less than 100 different games, and it's a real testament to his skill and talent as a voice actor that he could pull off such an unsettling and otherworldly voice for this game.
Not at all. I beg your pardon if I've offended you.
It's kind of scary.
After Ike gets sent back to the present and wakes up in the small coffee shop he began the game in, he quickly surmises that this was far less than a dream, as he takes out the small digipad he received from the mysterious voice in limbo and aims to plot out a course to avoid his rapidly approaching death. This final destination formula of dying and then returning to the present to work out how to avoid it presents the main loop of the game, opening every chapter with Ike's death and then tasking the player of finding a way to avoid it. While this may seem a little repetitive in theory, in practice, the game does a much better job of mixing things up consistently enough to keep the game interesting throughout its short runtime, with its different murder scenarios, characters and time periods remaining a compelling hook for the duration of the game. The gift of the digipad from the mysterious figure is our main time-travelling device throughout the game, alerting us via a green pulse whenever an interesting development has occurred in a different time period outside of our own, or we're in danger and need to quickly return to the present day. All that time travelling doesn't come free, however, with Ike having to continually find energy units for the device in order for it to work, with a few scattered throughout Lebensbaum during each different time period. So, as long as you remember where at least a few of these are located during each era, getting refreshed once again every time you return to that time period, it shouldn't present too much of an issue to keep the digipad continually charged. With Ike now back in the small coffee shop in Lebensbaum, He makes his way over to the fortune teller's building around the corner, who claims to have been expecting Ike all this time, telling him his awaited time of death is 2:30 p.m. Thankfully, the fortune teller offers Ike some advice on how to prevent his death this time around, namely to attract a small crowd of onlookers to the place he was attacked, which should be enough to scare off the murderer. Ike travels back to 1:30 p.m, 1 hour before the time of his scheduled death, and you'll need to keep an eye on the clock on the top right corner of the screen, which is continually counting down, with extra time being used up for actions and conversations. The player must constantly be aware of this time mechanic throughout the game, as if the clock ever reaches the actual time of his murder, whether Ike's in the present or in the past, it will present an instant game over screen, with the player sent back to the start of the chapter to try once again. Ike gathers some people to the nearby Marketplatz square near where he was murdered, where a street performer is giving a juggling show, thankfully attracting enough of a crowd to scare off his would-be killer this time around. Thinking the matter resolved, Ike heads back to the fortune teller once again to thank her for her information, but the fortune teller has some rather disappointing news for Ike, namely that he's only delayed the time of his own execution, and that the new hour is 3 o'clock. That concludes the prologue of the game, and we now move into the first chapter proper of the game, Chapter 1, which is by far the shortest chapter in the entire game, clocking in at not much more than 5 or 6 minutes in total. Upon leaving the fortune teller's house with the new information, Ike quickly sees a bar up in flames, with a young boy outside weeping for his trapped grandfather inside the burning building. The boy pleads with Ike to save his grandfather, which, of course, is the accepted path usually, with our brave protagonist striding confidently into the bar, which unsurprisingly leads to her second death of the game. Yet pretty hilariously, Ike can turn down the kid, stating just wait for the fire department, which is pretty cold, and casually heads off back down the street. It's in quirky moments like this where Shadow of Memories, really shines. Its awkward voice dialogue adding in an almost surrealist take to the scenes as well. Something its PSP remaster smoothed over and changed, yet did lose some of the early PS2 magic in the process. Part of the charm of Shadow of Memories is the time it came out in, with the emotion engines, face animation and stilted dialogue still in its infancy at that point, and no more on display than this extremely unique take on the murder mystery genre. No matter which option you give the boy, however, you will eventually end up making your way over to the bar, either directly or via a detour to the Marketplatz. And once at the bar, Ike once again comes unstuck, trapped inside the flaming building as the smoke and fire overcome him. Homunculus, as we shall soon come to know our mysterious benefactor, sends Ike back to just before the incident at the bar, giving him a cryptic warning that avoiding fate is never so easy. Once back inside the burning bar, Ike quickly teleports out to safety to just before the fire started, catching the culprit in the act behind the building, only to quickly lose him again down a side street. However, due to catching the culprit trying to start the fire, Ike can certainly chalk this one down as a success, witnessing the people on fire disappear from outside the bar during his current timeline, thereby preventing his second death. That short first chapter leads on to Chapter 2 for Ike, where everything seems to be going smoothly for him at this point, flirting with the cafe waitress Dana in the Marketplatz after she brings him back some of his stuff, namely a lighter plus a strange red jewel he seemingly left in the cafe earlier in the day. Also, this conversation between the two is probably one of the most unintentionally funny in the entire game as well, with the voice acting almost bizarre at times.
There's a lot of people out there whose lives are a lot tougher. Well, like me.
Okay.
However, the flirtatious mating between the two quickly comes to an end when Ike is stabbed once again, with the homunculus hinting this time around that removing the tree the attacker hid behind should remove the threat in the chapter ahead. Now, while I do praise this game on a number of levels, most notably for its choice and consequence, plus the fact it did blaze a trail for games like this in the first place, nonetheless, there are some absolutely batshit crazy ideas in this game. I mean, if we know the killer is going to strike from the tree, there are literally a whole bunch of different ways we could prevent the attack from taking place than the one the game comes up with. Alert the authorities, draw attention to the killer by, shouting up into the tree, set fire to the tree, don't even go near the Marketplatz in the first place. But, while these would present some of the more sensible options in my mind, not in Shadow of Memories evidently, as in this game the easiest way to stop the killer striking from the branches of the tree is to travel back to the year 1580, get the squire's groundskeeper to not plant the tree in the first place, and then travel back 420 years into the future to the present day to carry on as normal. Whatever works, I guess. Once Ike returns to the conversation with Dana, which can actually happen a few different times with slightly alternate dialogue if you want to mess around a bit, he uses the digipad to escape his attacker, only this time it sucks Dana into the time loop as well, sending them both back to medieval Germany. Once Ike lands in the new time period, with the colour palette of the game changing depending on what time period you're in as well. A nice touch overall. Ike is quickly thrown into an argument between some townswomen and another young woman as well, who they describe as using witchcraft. Ike's sudden appearance not helping matters either. Again, the puzzles in this game are generally fairly light, but fun, with Ike able to scare away the townsfolk with either his lighter or mobile phone, something the young woman is incredibly thankful for. Unfortunately for Ike, though, his previous partner Dana is now nowhere to be found, with the new girl Marguerite suggesting they get off the street quickly should some other guards come back. Once back at Marguerite's house, Ike meets her younger brother Hugo and sick mother Helena in the bedroom, with the mother ominously noticing that,
Yeah, something like that.
Your friend's voice is remarkably like your father's.
That's interesting.
We'll get back to that one later. Hugo, meanwhile, seems extremely interested in the time travel device Ike has, even making a wild guess as to what it actually does as well, something Ike does little to dissuade him of. Ike leaves the Wagner's home to search for Dana, running into the groundsman near the centre of the marketplace on his way, the man who would eventually go on to plant the ill-fated tree. The groundskeeper, however, refuses to hear out Ike's request of not planting the tree, insisting that only the squire has the approval to make any changes necessary. So our next destination is off to the squire's residence to get said approval. After a bit of bribery and some ladder climbing, Ike returns with the squire's seal, whereupon the groundsman relents and agrees to Ike's demand of either planting a flower bed in its place or putting up a statue of Ike there himself. Whichever choice you make has little bearing on how the rest of the game plays out, with the only difference really being whether or not you pulled out your phone or your lighter during the initial exchange with the townspeople earlier, determining which of two poses you get should you choose the statue. With that task completed, Ike returns to the present day, unfortunately without the still missing Dana, so no more coffee and flirting for Ike it seems, yet he quickly cheers himself up upon seeing either the new flower garden or the statue of himself that now sits front and centre in the local town square, a cosmetic change that has saved his life. The hits keep on rolling in Chapter 3, with Ike now falling foul of a precariously placed vase placed high above him, a debt that has Homunculus clearly irritated at this point and losing patience with the hapless Ike, telling him to concentrate and do something useful for a change. Once back in the land of the living, Ike gets a phone call from Eckhart Broom, the curator of the local museum, and the reason why Ike was visiting Lebensbaum in the first place. On his way to meet Broom, Ike runs into the filmmaker Oleg Franzen, a descendant of the famous painter Karl Franzen, whose paintings we'll run into continually throughout the game, with Oleg lamenting his career and complete lack of direction, something that the time-travelling Ike will soon help him out with. Once at the museum, Ike discusses alchemy with Eckhart Broom and comes away with a small grimoire Eckhart has been keeping, detailing a Dr. Wagner's rich past within the small town. From here, Ike checks out the rest of the museum before running into her old friend Homunculus, the first time within the living world in the game, which it's fair to say unsettles Ike. You can actually die at this point of the game also if you choose to give Homunculus the wrong response, with Ike demanding proof of the strange being's good intentions before trusting it further. That proof of good intentions gets Ike transported back to 1979, running into her old friend Oleg Franzen along the way, who witnesses Ike's time-travelling shenanigans, along with a much younger Eckhart Broom proudly proclaiming that he's now a father also. For the moment, Ike is trapped back in 1979 with Homunculus draining all of her energy units as a test. That means a little town strolling is in order to pick up some energy units so we can return to the present day to find out who or indeed what is trying to kill us. Once back, we find Mr. Eckhart standing suspiciously close to a vase near the window. A vase that looks remarkably similar to the one that killed us back at the start of the chapter. Ike mentions the daughter he heard the younger Eckhart shouting out in his earlier visit to 1979, and the shock of this unexpected memory causes Eckhart's face to tip over the other way, thankfully for us, with Eckhart explaining that his daughter was kidnapped shortly after her birth in an attack that also killed his wife. Downstairs in the museum, Ike once again runs into Homunculus, who stresses that it and Ike are on the same team, telling Ike that he will soon run into the red stone Dana offered him once again, and that when he does, to give it to the same Dr. Wagner Eckhart mentioned in his little grimoire. Well, we may have dodged the vase assassin in Chapter 3. Chapter 4 sees us once again getting stabbed up close, almost like the developers were running out of effective ways to off someone by the halfway point of the game. Homunculus urges Ike to find something to protect his chest with, an iron plate if possible, and with that Ike heads off to a new time period, namely 1902. Again, the colour tone of the game shifts here to black and white in order to better represent the time period. And it's a nice touch, honestly, just like it was during the medieval time period, and to consistently keep track of when and where we are in the story as well. Ike meets the former owner of the museum, Alfred Broom, in this time period, Eckhart's great-grandfather. Yet it's not a museum just yet, instead housing Alfred and his 2 children in the squire's former residence after his wife and parents passed away not long earlier. Alfred takes a liking to Ike, especially his suggestion of turning his huge house into a museum, and invites the young man inside his house to meet his oldest daughter, Sibylla. As Broom leaves to find a photographer to take their family picture, Sibylla offers to fix Ike's jacket, which got torn at some point during the game, allowing him to put on the white juggler's costume that we saw earlier in the town square. It's at this point that Ike asks Sibylla where he can possibly find an iron plate or frying pan, with the young girl obviously suggesting a restaurant.
Well, duh.
Ike then quickly remembers all of the frying pans that were in the bar that burned down earlier in Chapter 1, quickly making his excuses to Sibylla and returning to the present day. Now, this part can go one of a few ways for our hero, with Ike writing on the egg ornament he got from Sibylla to get a thick iron plate, which he then hands to his former self in the town square that we saw back in the prologue. Alternatively, if you refused the boy outside the bar in Chapter 1, you'd have already received that egg, and a good chance of having already picked up the frying pan also. So the entirety of Chapter 4 can essentially be skipped if you manage to whip out the frying pan in time at the very start of the chapter. Another method to avoiding death is to take the photographer Mr. Franson's shop sign from 1902 to use as your iron plate, only after you hear of his name from Alfred and Sibylla, that is. These different options scattered throughout the game to avoid death really do add a ton of consequence and replay value to the game as a whole, and the ability to skip chapters entirely, provided you have the right item equipped, really shows the developer's confidence in the game's mechanics as a whole. Returning to 1902, Ike takes the family picture with Sibylla and Alfred, yet the young girl tells Ike she recently saw him taking a key from the study, to which present Ike has no idea about, hinting that multiple versions of Ike may be running about and operating at the same time. With the frying pan now in tow, Ike returns to the present day and prevents the killer from striking, but once again fails to catch sight of the killer in the process. All of that dodging murder has understandably built up a hunger in young Ike at this point, and he now sets off for Borzumai from back in Chapter 1 to chow down on a good meal, stopping to talk to any of the town's characters in whatever time period you happen to be in will often yield clues as to what Ike's expected to do next. Yet it's this part of the game that is arguably its weakest aspect for me, with Konami's hand-holding and rather childish dialogue ruining the overall atmosphere of the experience. Take this power walker, for example, who you run into on your way to Borzumai, telling you in his only line of dialogue that the owner of the former squire's mansion from 100 years ago had a tough time choosing between whether to open up a museum or a library. This statement is such a jarring immersion breaker that, you know, if this was said in the real world, you'd honestly call the cops on the guy. Imagine making small talk on the present day, and the first thing out of a guy's mouth is that the local library was at one point considering becoming a museum back in 1925.
Wacko!
Once at the bar, Ike orders the local delicacy while reading the small book he received from Eckhart Broom in the museum earlier. While the food is being brought up from the kitchen, however, a young woman distracts the owner, which is enough time for the killer to strike, poisoning Ike's food. Now, this part of the game actually had me stumped for the longest time, as I thought, you know, it was the woman who poisoned Ike's food, going by the way the scene is directed. So, you know, who is this mysterious woman? What role does she play? Even long after finishing the game the first time around. However, going back and replaying the scene slowly for this capture, it's clear the killer's arm is different and that they just used the woman's appearance to distract the owner in order to slip the poison in. After exiting Barzoom Ike is quickly consumed by the effects of the poison and dies, to which Homunculus points out what poison it was that he ingested and where to find its antidote. Again, you're never left too lost in this game, as Homunculus always points you in the right direction, as well as both the fortune teller and townspeople doing their part also. And after going back to 1902 and changing Alfred's mind about his building becoming a museum to a library instead, we can then use that knowledge contained within the new library to research the poison in the present day. Once Ike returns to 2001, he heads to the newly standing Broom Library and learns from an old apothecary book that the only way to counteract the effects of the female sea hare poison he ingested is to take its exact opposite, a male sea hare antidote, once the initial effects of the poison are felt. Unfortunately for Ike, both the poison and its antidote appear to be extinct, not having been traced in some 500 years, likely meaning our mysterious killer is a time traveller also. Knowing he won't find any answers in the present day, Ike travels back to the Middle Ages once again, although curiously to 1584 this time around, 4 years after his initial appearance in the time period, and too late for the answers he seeks inside the Wagner household. At this point in the timeline, the Wagner household is nothing but a smoke and ruin, with its demise as of yet unclear, and Ike must find a way to gain admittance to what's left of the house through the protests of a rather unfriendly looking dog. Once inside, Ike catches sight of a homunculus who interestingly fails to recognise him this time around, yet he manages to pick up the basement lab key left behind from the explosion. Going back 2 years prior sees the house now fully intact, and with Ike using the key he found in the ruin, he manages to gain access to the basement lab, with him meeting the famous Dr. Wolfgang Wagner for the first time. After the initial surprise of this unwelcome visitor, Wagner then begs Ike to find a piece of the Philosopher's Stone for him that he just mentioned, before Ike is then asked to leave and go upstairs, where he once again runs into Marguerite. Of course, this is the same young woman we met from earlier, signifying that her and Hugo are Wolfgang's children. And upon seeing him again, Marguerite informs Ike that her mother has since died, but reiterates her brother's story of Ike being a time traveller and begs him to tell her some stories from the far-flung future. Ike relents and accompanies Marguerite on her errands throughout the town, regaling her of stories from the distant future. As Marguerite is busy at one of the houses, however, Ike believes he may have seen Dana off in the distance, the same coffee shop girl who disappeared 2 years earlier. Ike chases the figure down, but somehow loses her in the back streets, giving up and then returning to the Wagner's house with Marguerite. Once inside, with the sea hare antidote Marguerite gave him in his possession, Ike is set on returning back to the future, but before he can do so, the most consequential choice of the entire game pops up, with what you answer Marguerite at this moment of the game deciding on which one of 5 distinct endings you get for the finale. Now, these aren't necessarily from best to worst either. Don't picture ending A as the best and E as the worst, as in some endings you're left completely clueless as to what's actually been going on in the story, while in others you get the truth, but in a remarkably depressing way. On my first playthrough of this game a few years back, I ended up sidestepping Marguerite's question about being her ancestor, and unbeknownst to me at the time, locked myself out of endings A, B and C as a result, going on to eventually wind up getting ending D. A pretty somber ending overall, but one that at least filled in a lot of the backstory and questions I'd had throughout the game. For this playthrough, however, I wanted to go with something different, obviously, so instead of sidestepping Marguerite's question, I opted to tell her that she was indeed my ancestor, which then pushed me into endings A, B and C. Return to the Future with Marguerite's gift of an antique comb that she gives us. Ike is then able to take the antidote just in time outside the bar in order to counteract the effects of the poison, thereby saving his life. Again, the game really does a great job of opening up at this point, with you able to go cake shopping for Marguerite, stop Hugo from getting bullied, picking up a kitten for Sibylla from Eckhart, and so on. Numerous different side quests that, while offering very little from a levelling up or XP perspective, do a great job of fleshing out the world and characters as a whole. Those warm fuzzy feelings are short-lived, however, as kicking off Chapter 6 sees Ike getting run over by a car as he's left alone on the street after some girls are less than impressed by Oleg Franson's new movie, The Meditating Man. Homunculus urges Ike not to stay alone for too long in the present, and to try to find some way, just as we managed back in the prologue chapter of the game, to gather a group of people together in his nearby vicinity. Obviously, the hint at the start of the chapter about the girl's disinterest in the new movie is our main clue here. So we head back to early 1980 to meet with a much younger Oleg Franzen and try to help him out with some of his movie ideas. There are 4 possible outcomes for a new movie here, 2 of which will get us killed once again, just like the meditating man did earlier, with the crowd quickly becoming disinterested. Well, the 2 others will generate enough of a crowd to make sure Ike is safe back in the present day. Again, there's nothing particularly difficult about this task, just pick the most exciting option each time, basically. In return for your help, Franzen will give Ike a Fabergé pocket egg watch, which is a pretty decent gift considering the 5 minutes of effort that were involved. From here, Ike simply returns to 2001 and checks out the result of the movie he inspired, effectively ending the chapter. But in a neat little side quest, you can actually save the museum curator's wife, Eckart Broom, if you head over to the southern part of the town. This drastically alters the future, at least for Eckart Broom, and also gives us that 4th movie option as well, with Franzen witnessing the murder scene. Seems there are plenty of people getting murdered in Lebensbaum for such a small town.
Tonight on Murder, She Wrote.
Now, the first time you arrive at the scene, Miriam, the curator's wife, has already been killed and her baby kidnapped, with Ike surprisingly seeing a homunculus walk off with the baby in the snow. We're obviously left with a ton of questions at this point. Did a homunculus kill Miriam? Why has it kidnapped the baby? And perhaps most puzzling of all, with Eckart calling out for his kidnapped baby Dana, is this the same Dana from the cafe we met earlier on and who he subsequently left back in the 16th century? Way to go, Ike. And if indeed this was the case, why did Eckart say he'd lost his daughter all those years before when she's clearly working just around the corner at a local coffee shop? I guess museum curators don't drink a whole lot of dulce lattes. After failing to save Miriam for a second time, it's easy to become disheartened at this point, especially with homunculus trying to dissuade us from saving the woman by stating that you can't change fate. Persevering, however, with Miriam running away for a 3rd straight time, Ike really needs to work on his women's skills. You can actually chase her in the dim visibility of the snow this time around and save her life, although the baby still gets kidnapped regardless. Returning to the present day, and it's clear Oleg Franzen's new movie about a time-travelling detective hunting a serial killer is going to be a major attraction, drawing enough people to put the killer off for another attempt. At this point of the game, Eckart Broom calls him once the alchemy book he lent Ike back at 11:30 at night on top of an old tower. Nothing suspicious about that, of course. Once Ike reaches the tower at the start of Chapter 7, he is quickly locked inside and is forced to make his way to the top, predictably getting pushed over the edge once he does so. It's clear Eckart has some kind of hand in Ike's murders at this point, with both the vase and the tower being 2 major red flags. So now the task is to try and find a way into the tower without him knowing in order to catch him in the act. In order to do that, we must head back to 1902, when the library or museum was still just a house, and take the key from the study, hinting at what Sibylla saw us do earlier. Once we have the key in hand, Ike heads over to the tower next to the house, where he finds a newly made rope, which will be our main lifeline in this chapter as we try and avoid falling to our death. Taking the rope at any other time period outside of 1902 will ensure our death, as taking it in either the 1980s or the present day will ensure that the rope is effectively rotten by that point, snapping as we fall and dooming us as a result. Returning to the night before the murder back in the present day, Ike ties the new rope to the railing at the top of the tower, only to find Mr. Eckart on his return trip downstairs talking mysteriously to someone about his missing daughter. Skipping ahead 24 hours to the night of the murder, Ike is able to grab the rope as he's pushed. Not sure why he doesn't just challenge the attacker directly and save himself, with only the antique comb Marguerite gave him clattering to the ground. Once Ike manages to pull himself up to safety, he confronts Eckart in his office, a little too passively for my liking, saying as this is the guy who's tried to kill him twice. But after he sees Eckart with the comb he presumably picked up off the ground on his return inside, he does feel sorry for the old man and tells him he can keep it. This is because Eckart claims it resembles the one his daughter had the day she disappeared. His wife, provided of course that you saved her in the previous chapter, confirms this also, saying the comb is almost an exact match to the one she gave Dana to hold as a baby, you may have already begun to suspect something isn't quite right at this stage in terms of whose daughter is whose, as Marguerite has already told Ike that she vaguely remembers some other man patting her head when she was very young. Great memory for a baby, in fairness, and that her comb is an exact match with the one the Brooms gave their daughter. After Eckhart apologises profusely for trying to kill Ike, stating he only did it in order to see his daughter again.
That's not good enough!
Ike leaves his office but sees a picture of what looks like Dana holding the red Philosopher's Stone on his way out. Chapter 8 is effectively the final chapter of the game and the only one that Ike isn't immediately gunned down in. To start off with, Ike needs to track down Dana back in 1584 to find the Philosopher's Stone, which can go one of two ways. If you told Marguerite that you thought she was your ancestor back in chapter 5, then Dana explains that after initially feeling, pretty overwhelmed by being stuck in the past, she eventually managed to adapt and actually grew to like it, feeling like she'd come home after a long trip. Again, if you haven't already figured out what's been going on here, this is another huge clue to suggest that Homunculus switched Marguerite and Dana in 1980 and placed them in alternate timelines. The reason for this bait and switch is as yet unclear, but Dana insists she's staying in the Middle Ages, similar to that Timeline movie from years ago.
No, let's go home! Come on!
I am home, Chris.
And after giving Ike back the Philosopher's Stone, she quickly heads off to continue her new life in 1584. However, if you didn't tell Marguerite that you thought you were related, just as I did during my first playthrough of this game, then there is a chance to convince Dana to come back to the present with you, provided you can pick up a thank you letter from her former boss at the coffee shop. Once the situation with Dana is resolved, Ike heads over to the Wagner's residence to give Wolfgang the Philosopher's Stone, upon which the alchemist tells him to return in 10 days' time. Obviously, we know this isn't going to end well for Wagner, as we've already seen the wreck of his house 10 days into the future, but Ike agrees to the proposal nonetheless. Skipping ahead 10 days and voila, the house is once again a smoking pile of rubble. But curiously this time, Ike does find some sort of time-travelling device in the basement. Has Wolfgang or our young friend Hugo finally managed to figure out the mechanics of time travel? Well, it turns out that he has, Hugo that is, as upon returning to the present day, the final stages of the game kick in, with Hugo calling Ike on a cell phone to come meet him in the marketplace. Once there, Hugo will either be holding Marguerite or Dana as a prisoner, depending on your choices so far in the game. Hugo blames Ike for giving his father the Philosopher's Stone in the first place, which in turn ruined their entire lives, with his father presumably dead and his house now gone, and so he set out for revenge. At this stage, Ike has a series of flashbacks confirming it's been Hugo all this time that has been trying to kill him. In exchange for Marguerite's life, who Hugo claims is Ike's ancestor after he heard them talking in the hallway earlier, Hugo wants Ike to bring him Homunculus, the being Wolfgang was trying to create from the Philosopher's Stone, and if he doesn't comply, he'll leave Marguerite in the future, thereby preventing Ike from ever being born. This is where the story really branches off into multiple different paths, seeing you either head back to 1980 to get Homunculus to confirm if it indeed switched Dana and Marguerite as babies, which would actually make Marguerite the Broom's missing daughter, and Dana our long-lost ancestor. Now all that flirting between the pair at the start of the game just seems awkward. However, Homunculus did this due to foreseeing that Hugo would one day threaten Ike with leaving Marguerite in the future. But with Marguerite now Dana, that would have no consequence at this point. A trip back to 1584 is also possible, with you burning Wolfgang Wagner's notes so Hugo can't make use of them. A trip to the fortune teller is another option, with her proclaiming that she is actually Hugo's mother Helena after he tried to resurrect her using the lock of hair that he kept. Something that didn't go quite as planned, as Helena's spirit remains trapped here on Earth. In my first playthrough of this game, I landed an ending D, as I mentioned previously, an ending which sees the full truth of who Ike is come out. By burning Wolfgang Wagner's notes, Hugo never learns the truth of what happened in the cellar, and so never finds a reason to look for revenge, eliminating him and Marguerite from the present day. Homunculus congratulates Ike in this ending in a rather sarcastic manner, with Ike then being shown a flashback of what really happened after the explosion in 1584. Ike is actually Wolfgang Wagner, one and the same, an immortal wanderer cursed by homunculus to wander the earth forever with recurring amnesia after Wagner wished for the gift of eternal youth for himself. Soon after, Wolfgang discovers that homunculus is not actually his alchemical creation, but actually an evil genie trapped inside the Philosopher's Stone, and after Wolfgang attempts to trap it, the genie curses him with his immortal amnesia. This ending sees a younger Wagner, Ike in effect, head away from the scene of the explosion and drift aimlessly for centuries until we encounter him back at the start of the game. This ending isn't the brightest, but it does at least clear up a lot of the story elements that are missing from some of the other endings in the game. This time around I finished with ending A, seeing a vengeful homunculus conjure up a demon image of Wolfgang Wagner after Ike asks for help in negotiating with Hugo. After Wolfgang goes to embrace Hugo, both disappear in a cloud of sulfuric smoke. Again, another hint is given here despite not being told outright that Ike is Wolfgang Wagner, with homunculus saying he couldn't bring back Dagna Wagner from the dead as he isn't actually dead yet. With homunculus's plan achieved, securing its own freedom, it orders Ike to hand back the digipad, to which Ike in all his slapstick foolishness trips over himself and smashes the digipad on the ground, with one of the pieces of shrapnel from the device splintering and piercing the highly fragile homunculus, killing it outright. A highly satisfying conclusion given what we witnessed back in ending D. After this, Marguerite is later adopted by her actual parents, the Brooms, although they still seem blissfully unaware that she is their real daughter, with Ike seeming to form a relationship with her in the post-game credits scene, as well as the two head arm in arm into the marketplace on a shopping trip, with the finale of the game witnessing another giant oak tree with a strange red stone embedded into its trunk, hinting that fate isn't so easily changed. Sales figures for Shadow of Memories weren't particularly earth-shattering, with just over 200,000 units being sold at launch, a far cry from the over 500,000 units of something like the RPG Summoner shifted just a few months prior. However, with its re-release on both the Xbox and PSP platforms, Sony Europe later reported that initial figure of 200,000 had jumped all the way up to 1.5 million, turning it into a decent success overall and cementing its cult status among many fans. On its release, Shadow of Memories garnered largely positive reviews, with both IGN and GameSpot giving it a score in the mid-80s, with both outlets praising it as one of the most original games ever released on any system, something I'm in complete agreement with also. So in conclusion, does Shadow of Memories or Shadow of Destiny still hold up? And the answer to me is yes. It's no doubt a product of its time and maybe considered a little quirky by today's standards, but with multiple different endings, including 2 extended endings as well once all 5 of the main endings of the game have been cleared, similar to something like the GameCube's Eternal Darkness. While the short 6-hour runtime is brief, you definitely won't have seen everything this game has to offer on a single playthrough, even after 2 playthroughs such as mine, with the game encouraging you to replay it by letting the player skip cutscenes and replay from chapter points during those subsequent playthroughs. The endings are remarkably different, it has to be said also, with Helena involved at one point transporting Hugo away, Ike getting remarkably friendly with his great-great-great-grandmother Dana, Ike getting drunk and passing out, Ike getting run over by a car and so on, with no 2 endings being alike, with each only partially filling in the whole story as well, something you'll only fully piece together on multiple playthroughs of this game, or of course the Shadow of Memories wiki, which of course helped me out with the endings I missed in B, C and E. For me personally, while the game does have its drawbacks with, some cheesy character development, some undercooked NPC dialogue, which you mentioned as well, plus a main character that drying paint would be envious of. God, Ike Kush must be one of the most boring main characters ever to grace a screen. Shadow of Memories nevertheless shows a time in gaming when the envelope really was being pushed on all fronts, with the story, plot devices, game mechanics all combining to make this a truly memorable experience. As always, thank you for taking the time to watch and like the video, it's always appreciated, and until next time, hauling out, stay safe.